Yeah? Okay, great. Well, welcome back, and thank you for coming, to all of you here in this beautiful building, and also to anyone live streaming or watching on catch-up online. I'm Jono Gilmurray, and I'm going to be talking to you today about ecological sound art. So if we could switch to the presentation, that would be lovely. Are we able to switch the screen to the PowerPoint? Lovely. Great, thank you very much. Okay, so ecological sound art. So in recent years, of course, many different ecological issues, such as biodiversity loss, pollution, sustainability, environmental justice issues, and of course climate change, have grown to become some of the most significant socio-political issues, and many would argue, of course, moral issues of our time. Leading US environmentalist Bill McKibben has argued that rather than relegating these issues purely to the arenas of science or politics, it's vital that we allow them to form a central theme in our arts and culture. He notes that art, like religion, is one of the ways that we digest what is happening to us and make the sense out of it that proceeds to action. A similar thing is expressed by Malcolm Miles in his book Eco-Aesthetics, when he states, art inflects life, just as life inflects art. Representations of ideas establish them. And he reflects that perhaps I'm lost in a dream world if I imagine a post-capitalist, environmentally just and sustainably joyful society. Yet unless I can imagine it, I have no way to contribute to it. Art is an imaginative as well as an interruptive project, requiring a revisioning of the world's value structures. Now, in the visual arts, works which would become recognized by the collective term eco-art started appearing alongside the founding of the modern environmentalist movement in the 1960s. But it's been particularly over the course of the last 20 years, as people have become increasingly aware of and concerned about climate change, that eco-art, as well as equivalent movements in other cultural areas, such as eco-fiction and eco-cinema, have been growing and have become widely recognized. Now, sound art is no exception to this surge in ecologically engaged arts. There's a fast-growing body of artists using sound as a medium to address contemporary ecological crises, as evidenced by festivals and organizations such as Ear to the Earth and EcoSono. And in my research, in my doctoral research, I've been looking to bring together ecologically concerned sound works and analyze them, investigate them, in order to investigate their common strategies and characteristics as a coherent movement, which I've termed ecological sound art. And that term has been sort of growing, it's been gaining traction ever since. Now, one of the most important questions that we need to ask about ecological sound art, or indeed ecologically engaged art in any medium, is to ask whether it's not just an interesting diversion or an intellectual exercise, but whether it's something that offers real value as a means of engaging with today's urgent ecological issues. So to begin to approach that question, the first part of my talk is going to be investigating some different aspects of contemporary ecological theory. And I'm going to be looking at the parallels that exist between the new modes of thinking and being that they propose, and the ways in which we engage with sound art. And which I would argue reveal sound and listening to have really strong ecological characteristics and be a particularly sort of potent medium for this. So to start with, a ecological philosopher who some of you may have heard of, Timothy Morton, he talks a lot about the sort of what fundamentally what ecology is, or maybe what it should be. And of course, the fundamental definition of ecology is not simply the study of the environment, it's not the study of living things in isolation, it's the study of the relationships between things. It's the study of systems, ecological systems, or ecosystems, of course, examining how the different elements within that system relate to each other, interact, and impact upon one another. The study of the interconnectedness between all the different elements of the Earth's ecosystems, including us, of course, can be understood as perhaps the fundamental pillar of ecological theory. And in their book, Ecology Without Nature, Morton deals with the issue that we often separate ourselves from this thing which we call nature, which we subconsciously conceive of as something over there, or perhaps we put up on a pedestal as this thing that we humans perhaps enjoy being close to, or enjoy being within, or maybe have a responsibility to protect, but still preserving this distance, that there's this thing over there called nature. And for Timothy Morton, one of the most crucial psychological shifts that we need to make in this era of multiple ecological crises is to do away with this idea of something called nature that's separate from us, to be able to fully understand ourselves as really deeply embedded within the Earth's ecosystems as an inherent part of them, radically impacting upon other parts and also being radically impacted by them. And Timothy Morton, in another of his books, describes our understanding, our really deep understanding of this principle of interconnectedness as the ecological thought. They also coin another new term they called the mesh. They use the word the mesh to describe the ecological network of interconnectedness between everything that exists, whether natural or human-made. They note that the mesh of interconnected things is vast. Nothing exists by itself, and so nothing is fully itself. They also add, each being in the mesh interacts with others. The mesh isn't static. We can't rigidly specify anything as irrelevant. So perhaps the next logical question is, how do we sort of unlearn this psychological conditioning in order to truly begin to think the ecological thought and act accordingly? Well, in a book called The Spell of the Sensuous, philosopher David Abram states that the only way to truly internalize this principle of ecological interconnectedness is through the cultivation of our sensorial perception of the world around us. To do this, he says, is to enter into a sympathetic relationship with the perceived. Perception, in this sense, is a synchronization between my own rhythms and the rhythms of the things themselves, their own tones and textures. He says that when we become sensorially attuned to the world in this way, this will result in an embodied understanding of our place within the Earth's biosphere. As we return to our senses, he says, we gradually discover our sensory perceptions to be simply our part of a vast, interpenetrating webwork of perceptions and sensations borne by countless other bodies. It is indeed, he says, nothing other than the biosphere, the matrix of earthly life within which we ourselves are embedded. Yet this is not the biosphere as it's conceived by an abstract and objectifying science. It is rather the biosphere as it's experienced and lived from within by the intelligent body, by the attentive human animal who is entirely a part of the world that he or she experiences. Now, of course, Abraham here is not just talking about listening to the birds. He's talking about becoming sensorially attuned to everything around us, whether living or non-living, human, more than human, in order to experience the real vitality of things, not just passively existing, but as active agents interacting with each other. And this sort of notion of things is picked up by another philosopher, Jane Bennett, in her book, Vibrant Matter. She argues that it is precisely our failure to acknowledge the vitality and power of the more than human, and not just animals, but all matter, which she says feeds our human hubris and our earth-destroying fantasies of conquest and consumption, preventing us from detecting, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, a fuller range of the non-human powers circulating around us and within our bodies, and impeding the emergence of more ecological and more materially sustainable modes of production and consumption. Much like Abraham, Bennett advocates a cultivated, patient sensory attentiveness to non-human forces as the key to enhancing our perception of their agency. She argues that such a newfound attentiveness to matter and its powers can inspire a greater sense of the extent to which all bodies are kin, in the sense of inextricably enmeshed in a dense network of relations. So returning there to the concept of the ecological mesh and the relationship being key and our sensing of that relationship. So to properly connect with the ecological issues that we face requires a sensorial attunement to the other elements of the biosphere, the mesh of things that we understand as an ecosystem. So why sound in particular? Well, to answer that question, I think we really need to think about what sound is fundamentally. Sound is the physical result and the sensorial experience of something moving, something vibrating. And sound requires two things in order to exist in the first place. It requires a sound source, so the thing that is moving, the thing that is vibrating, but it also requires a cause, the action or event that causes that thing to vibrate in the first place. A sound source must be activated by something, or to put it another way, it must interact with something in order to create a sound, whether it's being struck or hit by another object or thing, whether it's being blown by the wind, or whether it's having some form of electrical current fed through it. Thus, we can sort of understand sound on a fundamental level as sensorial evidence of the different elements within a system, within an ecosystem, or within the mesh, interacting and impacting upon one another. That's what sound is. We are experiencing the interaction between different elements within an ecosystem. And when we experience sound, whether experiencing it as something that vibrates our eardrum and generating the neural signals that we experience as hearing, or whether we experience it as a physical force that we feel as vibrations and other parts of our body, we have then become a physical part of that ecosystem. We have been vibrated. We have been interacted with. We've been penetrated. We become quite literally, deeply, and intimately, physically connected to the other elements within the mesh, to the vibrant matter involved in that production of sound. So we are embedded in the mesh, and there is no escaping it. Now, this brings us to the area of acoustic ecology, which I know many of you may be familiar with. It's a fundamental pillar of acoustic ecology, sound's unique ability to reveal the network of dynamic relationships that exist between things in the world. And in his classic text, Acoustic Communication, acoustic ecologist and composer Barry Truax states that listening is the primary interface between the individual and the environment. And he points out that the interlocking behavior of sound, the listener, and the environment is understood as a system of relationships, not isolated entities. With sound, everything interacts with everything else. In other words, sound is our sensorial experience of the mesh. I'm going Sonic Possible Worlds here. Okay. In her book, Sonic Possible Worlds, sound artist Salome Vogelin notes that sound is the invisible layer of the world that shows its relationships, actions, and dynamics, and augments, expands, and critically evaluates how we see the world and how we arrange ourselves to live in it. And a similar thing is expressed by Frances Dyson in her book, The Tone of Our Times. She argues that the key to achieving a heightened ecological consciousness lies in discovering a new sensibility which is grounded in the direct sensing of the dynamic, vibrant world around us through sound. She argues this can help us to turn away from individualism and towards the mutually protective, collective space of a commons, a goal which she characterizes as furnishing us with a true common sense. What this implies, she says, is a need to understand, to sense, and to form common sense differently, not through discourse or information, no matter how compelling, but through sensing. And this is where sound and listening play a pivotal role. Sound's ephemeral and atmospheric nature is, like the environment, something that circulates outside of exchange and refocuses attention on the space and the environment of the subject rather than the subject per se. That offers some entry into the dilemma of how to hear the world and in hearing also be able to act with the aim and existential condition of the in common. And just to finally return to another few thoughts from Salome Vogelin in her book Sonic Possible Worlds. She talks about how we might move towards genuine and lasting ecological change, requiring not just the attainment of more ecological ways of thinking and being in the present, but so that we can conceive of alternative futures and to reimagine how things could be, or how things could be different. And the power of sound, and particularly sound art, to realize such a reimagining is, Vogelin argues, the key to its immense potential for socio-political agency. She states that to experience a sound work is to become submerged in a sonic possible world, which allows us to challenge the singularity of actuality and articulate a different sense of place and a different sense of self that lives in those possibilities and shows us how else things could be. Furthermore, when we emerge from this possible world, we don't do so into the world we previously inhabited, but into a different actuality, linked to and infected by new possibilities. For Vogelin, this has not only an aesthetic, but also a social and political significance, in that it has an impact on ideas about what the world and what the subject is presumed to be, and what else they could be. So to listen to a sound work is to create not only a new possible world, but a new possible listener with a renewed relationship with the world that is inherently ecological. As Vogelin explains, the listening subject inhabiting the sensorial sense of the work is not a humanist subject, but a post-humanist subject who lives in equivalence and reciprocity with her environment and understands her role as one of responsibility instead of superiority. So, I've ploughed through all this theory, all these different writers, all these different authors. Just as a sort of a bit of a demonstration, if we look at all this different ecological and sonic theory and combine it all together, we can come to a place where we recognize sound art as a medium that is inherently and powerfully ecological, in the sense that it provides an embodied, sensuous experience of the interconnectedness of our own bodies and our own being and our own agency with the agency of other beings, of all vibrant matter, as part of the dynamic and shifting mesh of the Earth's ecosystem. So having sort of covered this sort of theoretical basis for why we might want to pay attention to sound and listening and sound art to explore ecological issues, for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to turn to look at and, of course, listen to some case studies of ecological sound art, so that we can investigate how these ecological principles are embodied within specific works and through our experience of them. And in order to better understand what they're doing, through my research, I've identified 5 common approaches which are often taken by works of ecological sound art. So the first of those is enacting metaphors which facilitate a personal connection with environmental issues. Articulating the harmonious coexistence of humans, our technologies, and the natural world, because I do think you can't think about how the human impacts the world without also thinking about how all the things that we have created also impact the world. They can allow us to experience normally inaccessible aspects of the environment and of different ecosystems. They sometimes take the approach of communicating environmental or ecological data through sound. And finally, some works will also facilitate community engagement with ecological issues. So those are the 5 common approaches I've sort of come up with. I do just want to say that this is merely my own sort of initial step towards an analysis of what is a dynamic and growing field. So this shouldn't be taken to represent the full extent of the possibilities of ecological sound art by any means. They also shouldn't be understood as mutually exclusive categories, because a number of them may be and often are combined within a single work. So it's not this sort of perfect, neat framework, it's just a sort of a starting point to begin to explore what's going on in some of these works. So with that in mind, I'm going to look at many different ecological sound art works that fall roughly within these different common approaches. So the first approach is enacting metaphors which facilitate a personal connection with environmental issues. I've included a lot of, I'm not going to go into a deep analysis of any one particular work or artist. I'm more intending in this talk to provide an overview of quite a lot of different works, just to try and give a sense of the scope of the movement as a whole. So the first work I want to look at is a work called Glacial Soundscape by the British sound artist Max Eastley from back in 2005. This was one of the first artistic outputs from the Cape Farewell project, which some people may have heard of. It's a project which is still running, and it's taken a number of groups of artists, writers, and musicians on expeditions to the Arctic to experience the effects of glacial melting on the place and on local communities themselves, and to create works which respond to those issues. This particular work by Max Eastley involved two large blocks of ice suspended over an amplified aluminium sheet. This created a constant dripping sound which was punctuated by loud, dramatic bangs from stones which Eastley had embedded in the ice. And that was to reproduce the sounds that Eastley heard when up close to actual melting glaciers in the Arctic. This sort of gentle, constant dripping, but then there'd be a sudden crack or a sudden bang that would sort of, give you a jolt. So here's a little clip of that work. Got a sound from it. So I think part of what this work does is it facilitates an understanding that the melting of a glacier is not just a gradual, steady process that we can sort of relax into, but it can also be sudden and violent in nature. It also creates a constant feeling of nervous anticipation. We can't just sit back and relax to this lovely gentle dripping sound. It encourages a sort of anxiety, which is perhaps more what we should be feeling when we contemplate the melting of the Arctic ice. Now in 2007, two art projects, sort of almost simultaneously, allowed the general public to call on their mobile phones and listen to the melting of glaciers in real time. The first of those was called Calling the Glacier. It was by German musician and sound artist Calla. Here's a little clip of someone calling this telephone number.
Connected directly and in real time to the Berner Glacier, located in the Eastley Valley of the southern Austrian Alps at a height of 3,000 meters.
Almost simultaneously, British artist Katie Patterson exhibited her work, Vatnajökull, The Sound Of. And both of these works involved the artists burying microphones or hydrophones, underwater microphones, in glaciers and connecting them to a mobile phone line, which enabled audiences to call the glaciers and listen to the sounds of them melting in real time. In both of these works, the use of the medium of a telephone call has the effect of collapsing geographical distance and connecting the listener to the glacier on an intimate one-to-one basis. And it was literally one-to-one because only one person could get through on the phone line at a time. So this provides a sense of personal connection providing an embodied sensorial route towards the thinking of Timothy Morton's ecological thought, in which, to quote Morton, the ecological view to come is a vast, sprawling mesh of interconnection, its radical intimacy, coexistence with other beings, sentient and otherwise. So in these works, the power of sound in contrast to the visual becomes apparent, because when we look at a glacier, it appears to be immobile, unchanging, almost permanent. Of course, we can view time-lapsed footage to show its melting, but still our knowledge that that process has to be dramatically sped up in order to become perceptible can still fail to instill enough of a sense of urgency. When we listen in real time to the sound of a melting glacier, however, we can hear the process of melting occurring progressively, dripping, popping, and cracking as we listen. So it makes it feel more like it's happening moment to moment, it's happening right now. And through this medium of a telephone call as well, listeners experience the melting not as a record of a past event, but something that's happening right now in the present moment. So it kind of demands that we take concrete action now, before there is nothing left to hear. Now, Katie Patterson sort of paired this work in her exhibition with another one, which was called Langjökull, Snæfellsjökull, Solheimjökull. I know I'm mispronouncing the names of those glaciers, so I do apologize to the glaciers, in which she took recordings of the melting sounds of the 3 Icelandic glaciers, which are named in the title of the work, and pressed them onto records which were themselves made of the glacier's own refrozen meltwater. So the records themselves are made of glacial ice, and the sounds of those glaciers melting are what is on the record. And then she played those records on turntables until they again completely melted. So they were only played once and then didn't exist anymore. In exhibition, a video record of those ice records being played was projected onto the floor of the gallery. You might also notice that the sound of the needle on the runoff of the record almost sort of mirrors a heartbeat as well. Now, I think this is a particularly powerful work because a record, which of course normally is made of vinyl, is a medium we normally associate with the preservation of sound, perhaps the permanent preservation of sound, literally making a record of it. And that enables it to be played back again and again, almost sort of giving the illusion that the thing that made the sound is there in the room with us. These melting glacial ice records serve as a reminder that when the glaciers themselves are gone, they'll be gone forever, and we can't simply return the needle to the start. So I think this is a particularly sort of powerful work. Now, of course, it's not just the polar ice that's disappearing. A different ecological issue is that of the many different species of living creatures that are becoming endangered and extinct at an alarming and ever-increasing rate. Now, some really powerful works on this subject to do with birds have been made by New Zealand sound and radio artist Sally-Ann McIntyre, in which she focuses on the extinction of birds native to her home country. One of them, Collected Silences for Lord Rothschild, consists of recordings of the silences of stuffed specimens of 5 species of birds which were rendered extinct as a result of the European colonization of New Zealand. So this draws attention to their absence and questions the value of our possession of stuffed specimens when the birds themselves no longer exist as living beings. She's also made 2 works which focus specifically on the huia bird, which was rendered extinct in 1907 before any audio recordings of its call had been made. So instead, McIntyre uses written transcriptions made in the 19th century to to construct sound artworks based on its call, which we don't actually have a record of. In one of them, called Huma Transcriptions, she constructed a music box to play back its song, which she placed in one of the forests where the bird would once have lived, enacting a sort of a sonic haunting of the forest. And a follow-up work collected Huia Notations, which is subtitled like Shells on the Shore When the Sea of Living Memory Has Receded, features a recording of a piano playing the bird's song, cut to a wax cylinder, which was the only sound recording medium available when the bird was still alive. Now, since the wax cylinder is a fragile medium which degrades each time it's played, the act of replaying the bird's song for our own human consumption will eventually result in the total destruction of the recording and the erasure of the sound, mirroring our destruction of the species itself. Another work which deals with bird populations is Birding the Future by American artist Krista Caballero and Norwegian artist Frank Ekberg. It's an installation which explores the extinction of bird species from particular specific regions. It's so far been presented in Germany, Norway, Queensland, the Arabian Peninsula, the Sky Islands in Arizona, and Mid-Atlantic USA, with a 7th version focused on laboratory birds. And for each different location where it's been presented, an individual immersive surround sound soundscape has been created, featuring the calls of extinct and endangered birds specific to that region. Now, in this work, the calls of the extinct species are presented unmodified as a memory of what's been lost, but the calls of the endangered species are subtly rearranged to create Morse code messages which warn of their impending fate. And over the course of the installation, the density of the bird calls steadily decreases in line with projected rates of extinction to the end of the century, sonically enacting their future disappearance. Perhaps the most well-known of recent works about species extinction, though, is The Great Animal Orchestra by American field recordist Bernie Krause, based on his book of the same name. The exhibition has received huge popular acclaim and been staged in Paris, London, and it's currently installed in a museum in Massachusetts. Now, this work combines Krause's many recordings of extinct and endangered creatures, accompanied by a huge wraparound spectrogram realized by the group United Visual Artists. And a spectrogram visualizes the frequency makeup and amplitude of the sounds over time. Now, this partly demonstrates Bernie Krause's own acoustic niche hypothesis, which is his theory that in a healthy ecosystem, each creature has its own sonic niche, which is occupied by no other at that particular moment, much like the distinct instrumental parts in an orchestra. You can hear them all playing at the same time because they all occupy different areas of the frequency spectrum. So this sort of theory, it can be interpreted as revealing cooperation and harmony rather than competition and dominance as the governing principles within a healthy natural ecosystem. Also, as in Birding the Future, as time goes on through this installation, the calls of those creatures which have become endangered or gone extinct since Krause recorded them become fewer or disappear altogether, enabling the audience to sensorial experience the progressive diminishing of the Earth's biodiversity through sound. So the second of the approaches I want to look at is the articulation of the harmonious coexistences of humans, our technology, and the natural world. And I want to first look at a work which shares a lot of common ground with Bernie Krause's work. This is Italian composer and sound artist David Monarchi, who for the past 20 years has been engaged in a major research and sound art project entitled Fragments of Extinction, which is involved in gathering an extensive archive of ambisonic field recordings from the Earth's remaining areas of primary equatorial rainforest. And these recordings form the basis for educational sound artworks, which are permanently installed in purpose-built structures at the Natural History Museum in Svendborg, Denmark, and the National Rossini Museum in Pesaro, Italy. Much like Krause's Great Animal Orchestra, these works pair ambisonic rainforest soundscapes with a scrolling spectrogram, again designed partly to demonstrate the principles of Krause's acoustic niche hypothesis. But with these principles established, what Monarchi also does is adds a final layer to the work through making his own contributions to the soundscape in the form of electronically synthesized tones, sometimes pre-recorded or sometimes he'll perform them live. Crucially, what he does is confines these electronic tones to the available acoustic and temporal niches in the frequency spectrum. In his own words, thus building a powerful metaphor of one species that performs within a composite ecosystem while trying to find a balanced harmonic relationship to it, and thereby hopefully helping to create an ecological awareness for repositioning our species within nature. In the works of Californian sound artist David Dunn, such as his Autonomous Systems series, automated electronic systems are set up in natural ecosystems, such as forests, in which the soundscape is recorded, electronically processed, played back into the environment, and then recorded again, creating a feedback loop in which the predominant sonic characteristics and the natural resonant frequencies of that ecosystem are reinforced and amplified, resulting in a work which on one level is something of a collaboration between the ecosystem and the technological system, and where you could argue the technological system sort of becomes a part of the ecosystem, with each learning from and responding to the other. And Dunn regards these sonic experiments as a step towards humanity finding a way back into the interconnected ecosystem from which we've become estranged. He says, "My belief is that there is an important role for the evolution of an art form that can address the phenomenon of sound as a prime integrating factor in the understanding of our place within the biosphere's fabric of mind, reminding us of the profound physical interconnectedness that is our true environment." The third approach that I'd like to look at is allowing us to experience normally inaccessible areas of the environment or of different ecosystems. So another of David Dunn's work, called The Sound of Light in Trees, features detailed recordings of the pine bark beetle, an insect whose population has vastly increased as a result of climate change and which is responsible for decimating the population of pinyon pines in New Mexico. Dunn's recordings raise awareness of the problem, but also highlight some of the conflicting feelings that might arise. They simultaneously invite us to feel wonder at the complex sound world of the tiny beetles and horror at the destruction going on inside the trees. Now, he's made these recordings available on a CD, but the work goes far beyond just playing these recordings. to listen to at home. David Dunn discovered that by playing these recordings back to the Beatles and combining them with non-repeating synthetic sounds had a profound effect on their neural system, which caused them to stop their tunneling and feeding behaviors without actually harming them, enabling him to use his work as an environmentally friendly form of pest control to actively combat the bark beetle infestation. So this makes it a rare example of a work of ecological sound art which simultaneously constitutes the remedy for the problem it highlights. A different kind of hidden world is revealed by Norwegian artist and former marine biologist Jono Winduran, whose sound worlds provide a window into underwater ecosystems. One of her recent projects, entitled Silencing of the Reefs, has seen Winduran exploring the changing soundscapes of the Earth's remaining coral reefs to promote greater understanding of how they're being negatively impacted by human actions. As Winduran says, this relates back to the importance of that which lies outside our immediate perception. This is a field which we are usually not able to experience, and yet other creatures are operating there. For me, it's important to hear this field, since it's inhabited by beings who have existed for many millions of years longer than our own species. It's an issue of respect, of sensitivity, and of developing a questioning approach to the environment. Dark Sound by Spanish artist Miquel R. Nieto is an album of field recordings made in the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. But in contrast to the many albums of rainforest field recordings which stay strictly in the realm of natural environmental sounds, over the course of Nieto's work, the natural sounds of insects, frogs, and birds become increasingly dominated and finally completely obliterated by the sounds of engines, generators, pumps, drills, and vehicles. And this is the sonic evidence of the oil industry's progressive destruction of the rainforest. Now, to provide further information on that issue, the CD release of Dark Sound is accompanied by a 176-page black hardcover book containing a series of texts and documents in English, Spanish, Basque, and Huao, which further explore the industrial destruction of the Amazon from a variety of perspectives, crucially including that of the native Huarani people who have lived in the rainforest for many hundreds of years and are now becoming displaced. Rainforest Listening by Australian sound artist Leah Barkley features over 100 field recordings from the Amazon. But in this case, rather than being released on CD, they are geotagged to specific geographical locations and made available to listeners via the Reco app, which plays the recording when the listener physically moves through that specific location. It was launched in Times Square during Climate Week in September 2015, and is now permanently installed in Times Square and Central Park, New York, where it can be explored 24 hours a day. 2 months later, it was installed over a wide area in the center of Paris during the COP21 Climate Change Summit. And at the Eiffel Tower, Barkley also added a dimension of height to the work, assigning recordings to each level's viewing platform, which corresponded to the 4 distinct layers of rainforest vegetation. enabling listeners to experience soundscapes from the forest floor up through the understory and the canopy, finally bursting out into the emergent layer as they reach the top level of the tower. Now in this work, the audience member is sensorially caught between two different locations. Their ears are in the rainforest, their eyes and their feet are still planted firmly in the concrete jungle. So this expands our thinking from the local to the global. It encourages us to consider the ways in which our actions in the city might impact a rainforest in another part of the world. And Berkeley's work also crucially empowers audiences to make at least one of these impacts a positive one, through enabling them to make a donation to the Rainforest Partnership, which is an NGO which works with rainforest communities to help conserve the forest, using the mobile device through which they're engaging with the work. So Berkeley's work thus both sensorially connects people to the issue of rainforest conservation through sound and enables them to take positive action right at the moment of experiencing that connection. The fourth approach I want to cover is communicating environmental data through sound, which is often done through a method which is called sonification, which involves mapping data sets onto sonic or musical parameters to achieve something of an experiential, sensuous understanding of ecological phenomena, dynamics, and processes. The first work is perhaps the most simple but also powerful in its simplicity, the Extinction Gong by French artist Christelle Vu and New Zealand artist Julian Oliver. It's described by the artists as a ceremonial automaton for the sixth mass extinction, and it's a large traditional chow gong fitted with a mechanism that beats to the rhythm of species extinction, which has been estimated by biologist E.O. Wilson to be about 27,000 species a year, or one every 19 minutes. So every 19 minutes, the gong sounds. In addition to that, whenever biologists declare a specific species extinct, the mechanism receives an update via 4G and performs a short ceremony, 4 strikes of the gong in quick succession, followed by a text-to-speech utterance of the Latin name of the species. And the sound of the species name also resonates through the gong until it again falls silent. An artist who's done a lot of works based on sonification is the American artist Andrea Poli, who's collaborated with climate scientists and meteorologists to produce a number of sonification-based sound works. In her Airlight series, data from a number of air quality monitoring stations in different parts of the world are translated into sound to create a real-time sonic representation of the levels of various atmospheric pollutants. In Heat and the Heartbeat of the City, this is an online interactive work centered on the sonification of projected temperature increases in Central Park caused by global warming. And you can interact with this work and move through a timeline as the level of the sound gets progressively louder as temperatures increase. And Sonic Antarctica is the product of an artistic residency with the National Science Foundation, and it blends field recordings conveying Polly's personal experience of her time at the Antarctic at a research station, with climate scientists talking about the research they're doing and their own personal feelings around climate change, set to a backing of electronic sonifications of the climate data they are studying. Now, the thing about these sounds is, although without reading the liner notes, we can't directly discern the precise data, we are led to reflect upon the fact that the data which determines the behavior of these sounds is the same data which, as the scientists explain,
the Taylor
has
Glacier
dire
Met
implications for
Station.
the Earth. So this gives a significant...
The main thing that we're trying to do is monitoring long-term climate.
Should have rehearsed that, shouldn't I?
As opposed to seeing what the weather will be like the next couple days.
So this gives a significant conceptual weight to what would otherwise be innocuous patterns of electronic bleeps and tones. Sonification is also at the heart of the work of Alaskan composer and sound artist Matthew Berner. He is the guy who's founded EcoSono, which is a sort of activism network for ecological sound art. Among other things, he stages festivals of environmental sound art and workshops and residencies for people to create their own works. But he describes his work as a type of environmentalism in sound, which draws on environmental systems to structure music. And he's produced a large number of these eco-acoustic works. One good example is Ice Prints, which combines a hydrophone recording made beneath the Arctic ice with a piano part based on transcriptions of those recordings, whose pitch is determined by mapping the progressive decline in Arctic ice over a 40-year period onto the first 6 octaves of the keyboard, with each page of the score covering 1 year. Now, many of his eco-acoustic works are combined in his larger scale eco-acoustic operas, one of which is Auxalac, a multimedia opera about climate change in the Arctic. It combines these sonification-based eco-acoustic compositions with field recordings, video, a spoken and sung libretto, which poetically explores different aspects of climate change in the Arctic, and interviews both with climate scientists and with the native Alaskan Inupiat people whose way of life is being threatened by the melting of the Arctic ice.
Nowadays we don't have that snow. And one of our beliefs as a Inupiat people was the more snow that you have on the ground, the better fishing you will have, because you will have an abundance of fish.
One of the interesting things about this work is that in performance, different parts of the work are performed simultaneously in several different geographical locations and brought together online. So each audience experiences a different combination of in-person live performances and those transmitted from other locations, functioning as a metaphor for being impacted by geographically distant events and for the potential for people in different places to work together to achieve a common goal. And the audience also actively participates in this cooperative staging of the work through an app called Nomads, which enables them to contribute to aspects of the performance via their mobile devices. For example, at the beginning of the work, each audience member is given control of the speed and pitch of the sound of a single droplet of glacial meltwater. So together, the whole audience forms the sound of a melting glacier, forming a metaphor for the way in which we're all responsible in a small way for contributing towards our changing climate, and how when all of our seemingly insignificant actions are combined, it can result in the melting of an entire glacier. And finally, the fifth and final approach is facilitating community engagement with ecological issues. And one example of this is Chilean artist Graciela Muñoz Farida's El Sonido Recobrado, or Sound Recovered. And this is a work which deals with the ongoing issue of water rights in Chile, whose largest and most powerful river, the Baker, is just one of many being illegally dammed and drained by mining, agriculture, and hydroelectric companies, which is causing huge ongoing problems for local communities. And for this work, Munoz recorded the sounds of the Baker at different locations along its length and brought those recordings to her own hometown of Petorca, whose river was dammed and has been completely dry since the 1990s, where she played back the sounds of the Baker over 28 speakers set in the dry riverbed. So what she does here is she harnesses the power of sound to create almost a ghost river, haunting the dry riverbed, which temporarily brings to life the memory of what was once there and highlights the fact that the same is happening elsewhere. And as a site-specific sound art installation, it's important to recognize this was not made for a gallery or a museum in a distant city somewhere, but for the local community to come and experience it as a means to come together, to mourn for the past, to learn about what's happening elsewhere in the present, and to reflect upon its consequences. And of course, subsequently through dissemination of the footage of the work and information about its purpose, it does also function to raise global awareness of an issue that might otherwise only remain of local concern. A similar issue to this is tackled by Leah Barclay in the Dam project, which focuses upon the damming of the Narmada River in North India by hydroelectric companies and its impact upon the many communities who have been displaced, comprising over 30 million people. So Barclay has worked with local people involved in the Narmada Bachao Andolan activist movement to create collaborative soundworks composed from recordings of the river combined with testimonies and songs from people gathered in non-violent protest. And these works have been presented as site-specific sound installations, as the soundtrack to Zameen, a touring contemporary dance work, and as the soundtrack for a documentary film about the issue. In fact, Leah Barclay always makes community engagement a strong feature of her many ecological sound art works and projects. Another one on an even larger scale is Biosphere Soundscapes, which explores the ecology and environmental health of UNESCO biosphere reserves, which is a project I was fortunate enough to participate in myself as part of an artistic residency in the Sian Khan Biosphere Reserve located on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Now, all of Barclay's sound art projects stem from her firm belief in the power of sound art to impact how we approach today's urgent ecological issues. As she says, now more than ever, there is a critical need to listen to our environment and generate a paradigm shift that engages our auditory perception. Sound as a creative medium is undoubtedly one of the most powerful means to stimulate this shift in consciousness, exposing the state of the world and becoming an unprecedented tool in artists taking action in ecological crisis. So that's a selection of works of ecological sound art. There are many more. Just to conclude, as another part of my research, as well as identifying some common approaches in ecological sound art, I also identified a list of some of its key characteristics, which includes the use of listening as a pathway towards greater understanding, the promotion of an ecological mode of listening, a prioritization of listening over sounding, the use of sounding, when it is used, as a metaphor for ecological coexistence, a form that functions itself as an ecosystem, a blend of art with science and of ecology with environmentalism, and a combination of the educational with the philosophical. Now, it would be absurdly optimistic, of course, to claim that works of art in whatever medium are the answer to solving climate change, halting deforestation, or preventing pollution. But in order to properly connect with these issues and tackle them, it's imperative that we don't merely relegate them to the arenas of science and politics, but that we learn to engage with them in every aspect of our lives, in which regard our arts and culture is immensely significant. And I've hoped to sort of demonstrate today how sound art maybe directly embodies the modes of being and thinking proposed by today's leading ecological theorists, revealing it to be a uniquely and inherently ecological medium, something which, in the words of David Dunn, might perhaps serve as a conservation strategy for keeping something alive that we now need to make more conscious, a way of making sense of the world from which we might refashion our relationship to non-human living systems, and which might provide us with clues to our future survival. And that is a responsibility worth pursuing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jono. Is there any question from the audience? You are here because online we don't have any questions yet. Until you're thinking, I have a question.
Okay, sure.
Thank you so much for showing us those 5 different approaches, and it's probably also a summary of your work, and I really liked it. And you know, there are always those 2 almost competing terminologies in the literature, environmental and ecological sound art. And you decided on working with the second one, and that's why I wanted to ask you why, or you could just elaborate a little bit on that what is the difference between the 2, or is there any difference, or you would say that ecological sound art is like a broader concept in this way?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. These 2 terms do get used interchangeably quite a lot and get mixed up quite a lot, but of course an environment is a different thing from an ecology or an ecological system. An environment is simply a space, the space around something and the things within that space. And ecology is a system of interactions, a system of relationships. And the difference between those 2 things has already been very much reflected in the visual arts, where environmental art has become another sort of term for land art, art which is either sort of site-specific and exists in a particular environment, usually outside, or works of art which make use of things within an environment to create them. And that's contrasted in the visual arts with ecological art, or eco-art, which is to do with the systems of relationships within a specific place, and very often, or usually, is also highlighting ecological issues. And again, the word environmental and ecological is used interchangeably when we're talking about these sorts of issues. People might say environmental issues, they might say ecological issues. For me, the distinction comes, again, between thinking about simply a place and thinking about a system, a network of relationships. And for me, it's the ecology which is the more significant aspect when we're thinking about issues such as climate change. And so a lot of it was just sort of simply, following what is already very established in the visual arts, making this distinction between environmental art and ecological or eco-art. And you'll see it's reflected as well in the sort of, burgeoning writings that are now being made to do with sound art. There's a book called Environmental Sound Artists in Their Own Words, which I wrote the introduction to. And you'll see in that book, if you read it, that there are profiles of many, many different artists who make sound works to do with different environments in many different ways. It includes Joseph Bertolozzi's bridge music, which is making music from the sounds of sort of playing a bridge. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with any kind of, ecological issue, but it's making music from, things in the environment. So that, for me, is the distinction.
Perfect. Thank you so much, because I personally was also never sure about what is the difference between those 2. But thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a question.
Yeah, hi, thanks for this super interesting lecture and this overview. I was just wondering, because you said that one of the key characteristics of environmental sound art is like the greater understanding and also like raising awareness. So I was wondering, do you have a feel about the actual outreach? Like, who's the audience and how big is the audience? Or is this, like, does this stay within this niche bubble of art, like, which we are all part of? But how great is the greater understanding for how many people?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. Yeah, of course, sound art, like you say, is one of the lesser known art forms, I suppose. You know, it's generally not featured on the radio or featured on the TV, and in some ways it is a bit niche. Although, of course, there is a network of many different people who have a strong interest in sound art. I mean, partly it depends on the work and where it's staged and how well it's publicized. I mean, Bernie Krause's Great Animal Orchestra has become, you know, immensely popular. It's an immensely well-known work. As I said, it started off being staged at the Fondation Cartier in Paris. It was then staged in London, and it's currently in Massachusetts, and it had its run extended by several months due to massive popular demand. So that one has become incredibly well known. Others, like, you know, David Menarche's work has been the subject of an award-winning documentary film, and you know, and other works are very much smaller and take a bit of digging to find them. I think it is growing, but yeah, partly it depends on the work. I think also, though, I mean, there could be a question of, like, you know, this is such a massively important, or these issues, because, you know, more than one issue. These are massively important, global, urgent issues. Why explore them through this kind of niche medium of sound art, which doesn't have such a big audience as for other art forms? And I think the only answer really is that these issues need to be allowed to penetrate every area of our lives and every area of our interests. So you could argue that, yes, it will receive, you know, a greater reach in terms of numbers if we publicize them through popular music or through film or through things that are you know, are more popular. But then they may not speak to the people who aren't really interested in that side of things, but are really interested and really personally affected by sound and sound art. So I think that would be my answer, really, is that we've got to inject them into every area of our lives so that it can speak to everybody through whatever their own particular interests are.
Maybe one more question if you have. If not, I'm afraid we have to move on to the next presentation very soon. But thank you so much, Jono. Wonderful presentation. And thanks also for the audience activity. And yeah, in 20 minutes, we are going to go with the next presentation. So we will have like 20 minutes break now. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.